So we're continuing our discussion of the chapter from In Excess, Studies in Saturated Phenomena by Jean-Luc Marion, the chapter entitled The Icon or the Endless Hermeneutic. And we're up to section 3, which is called The Paradox of the Face. And what we're going to see in this section is that Marion is going to use the Levinasian concept of the face that we've already sketched a bit in the previous videos to develop his concept of the icon. And in fact, he's going to, in a certain way, dig deeper than the ethical phenomenon that Levinas focuses on as the essence of the face, and try to argue for a iconic status, so that the icon and the face, in Marion's understanding, are very closely related, if not identical terms, ultimately. And what this leads to is a certain understanding of how one needs to approach the face or the icon phenomenologically. There are certain distinctive problems. We've already kind of anticipated this with giving a phenomenology of something like the face or the icon because of the way in which they are invisible, to use the term that Marion uses, which is, of course, a very specific technical sense of invisibility that we were talking about last time. So that it doesn't appear phenomenally in the way in which the common phenomenon does. And I'm probably going to be coughing throughout this, so I apologize in advance, but allergies. Anyway, so how does he pursue this? And it's a fairly intricate discussion. It's really a fascinating piece of phenomenology, I think. He goes into quite a bit of detail about the face, and because of time, we're not going to be able to necessarily cover all the nuances and details of this. But we are going to try to give a sense of how he progresses from the idea of the common or ordinary phenomenon to the phenomena that don't fit into this ordinary description. First, the phenomenon of flesh, and then the phenomenon of the face. And he draws various parallels between these. And then how he digs deeper into the concept of the face in order to reveal the iconic character of the face, which leads him then to ask how we can possibly relate to the face. And all of this, I mean, the significant part of this discussion in both the case of the flesh and in the case of the face deals with the way in which it appears to us that we can, in fact, phenomenologically relate to the face and the flesh of the other. We know that the other has flesh. We know that the other has a face. We don't just know this in our own case, but we know it in the case of the other. But because of the peculiar character of flesh and face, it's a real problem how these things can appear, how we are to account for them in the terms of standard phenomenology. So that's what Marion is really exploring here. And what he ends up with then is this idea of an infinite hermeneutic. So the approach to the icon, or anything that has an iconic character, which of course could involve works of art, is going to have to involve a particular kind of hermeneutic, a kind of an interpretative approach that is, in a sense that he will specify, infinite or open-ended. Alrighty, so let's go on to the text then. I want to start a bit before the third section, at the end of the second section where we ended last time, to talk about flesh. So he talks, this is the top of page 113, where he says, before flesh, which feels and feels itself feeling without distinction, I cannot exactly locate myself outside in order to be in front of it, since it admits no outside, and since I am irredeemably in it, and I am of it. That is to say, what he's contrasting here is this phenomenon of the flesh with kind of the standard picture of both objective consciousness, that is consciousness of objects, ordinary everyday objects, my pencil, for example, And also with subjective self-consciousness, as it's usually understood as a form of introspection. So in the simplest case, we have objective consciousness where the subject, or the intention in the phenomenological sense, intends or is directed towards or is consciousness of or constitutes an object which has an intuitive content. So I'm conscious of this pencil because I have an active consciousness that is directed towards and constitutes this object. Now, I'm also aware that I'm doing this. I'm aware of myself, but there's a kind of split within consciousness when I'm just introspecting on my own consciousness between, roughly speaking, an I and a me. So I am the consciousness that's conscious of myself, but what I'm conscious of is not this I, but me. I can try to chase this I around, but there's always going to be a new I that appears, and what I'm always going to be conscious of is going to be only a me, right? So this is a me, or a kind of an object of introspection. Now, in the case of the flesh, we don't have these sort of two sealed off compartments any longer. There's just sort of one unitary form of phenomenon that doesn't divide itself into these subjective and objective sort of compartments. What we have is a perceiver and a perceived that are really identical with each other. As he describes it, that flesh feels itself feeling itself feeling. That is to say that what distinguishes, flesh from just meat is that I'm aware of my flesh insofar as I feel it, but I feel myself feeling it, and I'm feeling things with it. But in order to feel things with it, I also have to be feeling myself, and that's what the phenomenality of flesh consists in. So flesh, in this sense, sort of undermines this kind of subject-object divide. And there's a parallel here with face. When I'm dealing with my own face, of course, as opposed to, if I recognize myself, but I recognize that's my face, there's a kind of seeing myself. He describes this in the bottom of 113 this way. He says, "The face shares the privilege of flesh. In the same way that the latter only feels in feeling itself feeling," right? The same way the flesh only feels in feeling itself feeling. I only feel this pencil insofar as I'm feeling my flesh feeling it. Similarly, the face only gives itself to be seen in seeing itself. My face only gives itself seen in seeing itself. So the face and the flesh both have this kind of unitary phenomenal structure. Now we're talking about it in my own case, right? So this is distinct from the kind of introspective self-consciousness when I'm aware of myself, aware of there being a me in addition to the I that sees things. When I'm the consciousness, if you will, of my flesh doesn't have that kind of divided structure, and neither does the consciousness of my face. So that's the phenomenological point that that Marion derives essentially from the tradition, Husserl and Levinas. Okay, so the problem arises when I have to account for my evident awareness of the others. Well, we could say in general, my awareness of the other, period. Because otherness, in this sense, is not just to say that there's some other thing besides me, like this book or this pencil, but rather the other, the big O other means an other instance of whatever kind of being I am, another Dasein in the Heideggerian sense, right? Another human being, another human instance. So I'm aware of not just of myself, of my face, the fact that I have a face, we could say, right? Awareness of my face, awareness of my flesh, but I'm also aware of the face of the other. The other's face seems like it appears in some sense. The other's flesh seems like it appears in some sense. But how can it appear? How can those things appear as what they are? How can the face of the other appear as face? Of course, it's no problem to follow this schema and just, for example, see the face of the other as an object, as a physical object. But we've already talked about how to see the other's, just plastic features their visage and the way in which their face is, in the ordinary sense of face, is shaped and physically formed and so on. That's not to see it as a face. That's not to see it as something that expresses a kind of humanity or personality. So how do I possibly see the other's face as the face? It would seem like if you follow that formula that I see a face only in, sorry, let me get it exactly here again. The face gives itself only to be seen in seeing itself, right? If the face is something given to be seen only in seeing itself, how can I possibly see the face of the other? It would seem like I would have to, as it were, misidentify the face of the other as my own face. I have this video screen in front of me where I can look at myself if I so choose, although I'm trying to look into the camera. But, it seems like the only way I could see that as the face of the other is if I misidentified the face I see on the screen as something other than my face. But in that case, I wouldn't actually be seeing the face of the other. The face of the other wouldn't be appearing to me phenomenally. I'd be misidentifying it as my face. So how can we preserve both the phenomenon of the face and the phenomenon of otherness together in one phenomenality? That's the problem that he's confronting here. And the similar problem is contained in understanding how I can perceive the other's flesh, right? That the other has a sort of, a kind of feeling within that meat that I'm able to view. I'm not just, viewing the other as maybe, a cannibal would or something, as just a piece of animated meat, but as actually having that sort of unified feeling where we talk about the other's flesh feels itself feeling itself. Feels itself feeling. But it seems like, again, if I were to actually perceive that, I would have to somehow misidentify the other's flesh with my own, absorbing the other's flesh into my own body in some sense, feeling through it, and I would erase the distinction between self and other. So this is the problem that he's going to be confronting, and both here the flesh and the face are examples of these saturated phenomena that he talks about, where it seems like the phenomenality doesn't fit the ordinary categories because there's a kind of invisibility involved to these phenomena, which would seem to negate their very character as phenomena. So how is he going to deal with this? I've summarized here just in general a couple elements, maybe not exclusively, but two important elements of the way in which he relates the ordinary common phenomena and the saturated phenomena. So in these cases, we have the poor. He calls it the poor, the common phenomenon. The reason he calls it poor is it's poor in intuition. Oh, I'm sorry, I got this wrong. Got to change this. There you go. That should have been intuition. It was originally intention. So the poor common phenomenon and the saturated phenomenon have different relationships to intention. In the case of the poor common phenomenon, the intuition always falls short of the intention. And I talked about that last time, that any intention, if I'm looking for something, like I mentioned, I think the example of a glass. If I'm looking for a glass, I have this, this satisfies my intention. The intuition that I'm perceiving in this object actually does constitute what I was intending, but it's not everything that I was intending in the idea of a glass. There are all kinds of other things that are contained in the intention of a glass, wine glasses, glasses that are used for little glasses for juice, shot glasses, right? And this isn't all of those things. So there's a certain sense in which the intuition always falls short of my intention. My intention is never going to be completely captured in any given intuition. By contrast with the saturated phenomenon, the intuition exceeds my intention. And that's necessarily going to be obscure without looking at some examples. But the face and the flesh are both examples of this. So secondly, there's a relationship between the look and the object. So in the case of the poor or common phenomenon, the look constitutes the object. That's the gaze that constitutes the object. However, in the case of the saturated phenomenon, the look is constituted by the object. That's what he describes as the witness. And this makes the most sense in relationship to the particular saturated phenomenon that he calls the event. Because, of course, we're familiar with this idea of being a witness to an event. But it's the case with other phenomena as well, that he finds it useful to refer to this idea of witnessing as a distinct way in which the look is related to the object that distinguishes it from the constituting gaze. It's really a distinction fundamentally, of course, between activity in the case of the gaze, where I am the agent. My look is the agent or the activity that constitutes the object, where on the other hand, in the case of the saturated phenomenon, I'm in a passive posture. All I can do is sort of receive whatever the object gives me, and I'm in this passive posture of having to be just a witness. You know, a witness, think about like a witness to a car accident or a witness to a disaster or something like that. They didn't choose those things. They weren't expecting it. They were just passively acted upon by whatever the event was. And that's the way in which the face strikes us as witnesses to it in this passive position. Okay, so back to the text here then. On page 114, he says, this is right about, I'm not going to try to count lines, it's right about in the center, so you might want to pause it and find it here after I say the first few words. He says, flesh escapes phenomenality as such, as feeling, because only the felt can show itself by intuition. And besides, far from my flesh being able to constitute that of the other person, perhaps it can only experience its limits, thus its proper sphere, and presupposing the flesh of the other person, which, so to speak, would constitute it. So he's connecting the phenomenon of the flesh here, which is a problematic phenomenon, with this kind of relationship that we find between the look and the object in the case of saturated phenomena, where it's the flesh of the other that constitutes my flesh. So it's sort of indirectly that I become aware of the flesh of the other. How does that happen? Well, the other makes me aware of the limitations of my flesh, right? That my flesh doesn't extend out forever, but that in some ways there's a limit to my flesh in what the other is experiencing in their flesh. But he describes this in terms of presupposing. So there's still a kind of mysterious action going on here, where from somewhere I get a presupposition that the other has a flesh. Continuing on from the same spot where I ended off, the face offers a similar particularity. It is not seen as much as it sees. In effect, how can we distinguish a face from flesh in general? If the face shares the privilege of flesh, making itself be felt, but necessarily feeling and feeling that one is felt and that one feels, it adds to it a second privilege by which we evidently distinguish it from flesh, not only to be seen, but especially to see. We must not only oppose the facade, visible but inexpressive, to the face, visible and expressive, but also recognize by and on this face the unique characteristic of looking without having to be looked at. But this unique characteristic, which suffices to define the face as what looks at me, dictates specifically that I cannot see it nor look at it in its turn. What defines the face is that it looks without me having to look at it. It has a look. That doesn't depend upon my look, right? So my gaze is not what is imparting the look. It looks without me having to look at it. And he says that's sufficient to define the face as what looks at me. Whether it is or not is something you might want to think about. But I think what he has in mind here is that the fact that the other's face looks at me is first revealed to me phenomenally when I feel myself to be looked at, when I feel myself to be under someone else's gaze. That's the sense that, and I'm not responsible for that person gazing at me, but rather I'm not constituting them as an object, as a face or as a gaze, but rather their gaze is constituting me. And that's how, it's precisely in that sense of, for example, in the emotion of, let's say, shame or self-consciousness, when I see myself being looked at. I feel the flush of, I feel myself blushing or something because I feel ashamed. That's when I feel that the other is looking. Okay. Now, there's a kind of negativity involved here because if you ask, where's the face of the other located? What's his answer going to be? It's not in any particular feature, but it's in a sort of absence. It's in a sort of hole. In other words, he says it's in the pupils. It's in the nothingness, the emptiness, the blackness of the pupils. That the face is not really something that appears. It's not something that's visible. It's a kind of negative hole or space, namely the pupils, which are nevertheless expressive. We fix the face, he says, precisely. This is continue on to 115 now. We fix in the face. We fix on the sole place where precisely nothing can be seen. The point at which all visible spectacle happens to be impossible. There's nothing to see in the person's pupils. It's just black. So there's this reversal. I mean, you can think of it as a reversal of the ordinary situation. When I'm conscious of objects, I'm not conscious of myself. Right? I think it was Wittgenstein who had a famous line where he said, if I should write a book entitled The World as I Found It, or The World as I Find It, the one thing that it should not include in it is myself. And by this, of course, he's referring to the eye, right? This eye of consciousness. The eye, so to speak, behind the camera through which I view what's in my visual field. That is something that is not ever going to appear within my visual field itself. I'm always sort of behind it. And so similarly, so it's a kind of nothingness. And so similarly, we might say that when the situation is reversed and I see myself as the object or feel myself to be the object, that there's a kind of nothingness in the face of the other that looks at me this way. And of course, this raises a question that he immediately raises on page 115, which is, if the face, such as it is, that is to say, as the look posed on me, no longer offers anything to look at itself, should we not give up looking for a phenomenon there? Again, it's this persistent problem that we've been dealing with throughout really this whole chapter, which is, if you're dealing with phenomena of invisibility, aren't you dealing with a kind of oxymoron? I mean, how can there be something that appears that is invisible? So the way he deals with this is by suggesting that there's a different way to conceive of the look other than as a form of watching over, intuiting. So intuiting, to guard or watch over in its Latin root. And he says, I'm still on 115, to watch over offers only one of the modes of aiming and of possible vision. There are others, since not every phenomenon is reduced to an object. We have to admit that certain phenomena, for example, paradoxes, which remember was another term that he used for saturated phenomena, can escape the look and nevertheless appear, but they are unable to be looked at. Okay, so how? He goes on. We are indebted to Levinas for having fixed it in determining for the first time the mode of phenomenality proper to the face. Page 116. The way he describes it is, and this is quoting Levinas here now, is that it appears insofar as the face speaks. Now, by now, you're probably already anticipating that the speech involved here isn't what we ordinarily mean by speech. In fact, literally no material sounds are made in this sense. It's more the idea of the kind of silent expressiveness of the face. What we see when we recognize something as a face as opposed to merely, a statue or an inanimate object of some other sort. It's a kind of expressiveness, a kind of speaking in the face. Quoting him here in the top of 116, to speak is not necessarily the same here as making use of the physical word and the material sounds that it emits. Besides, this sonorous word never says anything, save if a non-said sense protects it in saving in it the welcome of an understanding or comprehension. So, of course, not even material words, not even the sound waves actually say anything before you interpret them as having a certain sense or certain meaning. That's what he's referring to there. Thus, the word is played first in the listening and in the silence of the sense. In this way, the face speaks in silence. The silence of the sense. Okay. So the speech is the kind of wordless appeal that a face has for us when we sense that there is something that it is calling on us to do. So the idea of the speech here is related to the idea of a call, the phenomenon of a call. You recognize a face in recognizing the call that the other is making on you, the claim that the other is making on you, we could also say. And this is what Levinas connects with the ethical phenomenon, in particular the injunction, thou shalt not kill. Continuing in the middle of the page at 116, he says, the face that cannot be looked at of the look of the other person only appears when I admit, submitting myself to him or her, that I must not kill. Certainly I can kill the other person, but only at a certain cost, because then the person disappears as a face, first of all. The person just becomes a thing once I've killed it. And secondly, I myself am transformed. I become a murderer. And forever I'm a murderer. And he says, the look of the other person will thus have taken the initiative and advantage over me. It will weigh on me even after its physical disappearance. Okay, so that's Levinas, and we talked about this before, and so this is not completely new. But what Marion wants to do, which is sort of interesting here, is beginning on 118 really, is to question Levinas's way of setting this up, although he approves of it and he thinks it accurately describes something about the way in which the face appears phenomenally, that the look is not to be understood in a sense of my eyes guarding and taking possession of an object, but rather of a kind of recognition of a word that's being spoken to me silently, a kind of silent call of the person's pleading eyes, as it were, that say to me, even without saying a word, don't kill me. So there's really something valid in that from Marion's perspective. But he says on the top of 118 that Levinas must be questioned on one point. This is 3 lines down. In admitting that the transcendence of the, and he's quoting Levinas here, face or of the infinite, unquote, beyond phenomenalities of the object or of being is really accomplished first in ethics, doesn't have to depend on it exclusively. Levinas himself, it seems, ended by doubting it. And that's his interpretation of Levinas. That is to say that that the recognition of the face is not essentially ethical. Ethics could simply, I'm quoting again, ethics could simply be put to work. Ethics could simply put to work here a phenomenological deployment more originary than it. That is to say, there's something deeper in the phenomenon of the face than this ethical injunction or ethical call. Don't kill me. Other descriptions of this phenomenon. He suggests that, we could imagine other types of ethical injunctions besides don't kill me that could be substituted for it here, which is some kind of evidence that there's something deeper going on here that's in making this possible. right? There's some deeper sort of phenomenality that's making possible the applicability of an ethical injunction to the face, or coming from the face, we might say. So skipping down to about 7 lines from the bottom of the same page, 118, he says, the face, saturated phenomenon, according to modality, accomplishes the phenomenological operation of the call more perhaps than in any other phenomenon. When it decides so, arrival, and imposes the point of view from which to see it, anamorphosis, as a fait accompli. That is why what imposes its call must be defined not only as the other person of ethics, but more radically as the icon. Okay, so that's a very dense and fairly obscure sentence. So let's go over it more carefully. The face, the saturated phenomenon according to modality, that's the way in which he describes the saturated phenomenon according to the Kantian categories. You don't need to worry so much about that. But going on, accomplishes the phenomenological operation of the call more than any other phenomenon, saturated or not. It happens event without cause or reason, incident and accident, when it decides so, arrival, and imposes the point of view from which to see it, anamorphosis, as a fait accompli. It happens, okay, the event. So first of all, the call is an event. Without cause or reason, incident or accident. It's not an event or that has some explanation or cause that we can at least point to. It just arrives and imposes the point of view from which to see it as a fait accompli. That is to say that it's always already the case that the call on us is determined by the call itself. And that call might take the form of the ethical injunction, don't kill me. It might take other forms. So he describes some possible examples. Become who you are, or love me. Right? These are other examples of the kind of call. But however the call of the face imposes itself, it always imposes itself as a fait accompli that just arrives as an event without any particular precondition or cause that at least arises for us phenomenally. So that's the way he's going to describe it more generally, right? So this is the more originary phenomenon that underlies what Levinas is talking about as the ethical claim, which is this kind of arrival of the call that just strikes me as a fait accompli, as having a particular determinate form, one way or another. A claim on me is being made in some way. Love me, don't kill me. A claim urging me to become who I am, encouraging me to love God. And it gives a couple other examples here too on page 118. So that's what he says is the phenomenon of the icon. That's the phenomenon of the icon that he's describing here. The icon is the more radical conception of the face. Last line of 118, continuing to the top of 119. Quote, the icon gives itself to be seen in that it makes me hear or understand its call. The icon gives itself to be seen in that it makes me hear or understand its call. One can only understand in this way that the face envisages me. You know, it gives me a visage. It's got an idea of me, right? It envisages me. If, for example, the call on me is become who you are, it's envisaging me as something that I am not now. You know, you can do better. It's like the teacher who encourages the student to realize their potential, right? Apply yourself more. That kind of idea. I'm envisaging you as something that is more than you are now. That's the idea here. The face envisages me. Its phenomenality never consists in making itself seen as one visible among others. In the face, in this sense, there is nothing to see, and it remains perfectly invisible. But its phenomenality is accomplished when it is made heard. Right. So the face. What is the face here? Well, the face is this it appears in this sense of myself as falling short of my potential, or it appears in this sense of myself that is being less loving than I should be of a person, or it appears in me in the sense of myself as being obligated not to harm someone. Right? So the face doesn't appear phenomenology in its own right, but it appears in this relationship of what it imposes on me. So he summarizes all this by saying that if to look at, right, is kind of the application of the gaze to constitute the object, then in this case, the relationship that I stand to the face or to the icon is one of, he says, respect. It's the counter concept of to look at. The counter concept to look at is to respect. I have to respect the call that's being made upon me. Now, dialectically, of course, this immediately raises the question in our mind, okay, if the face envisages me, how do I envisage the face? Or is it possible for me to envisage the face? I mean, what is this face that's making this call on me, right? We would actually might want to say, well, by what right do you demand this of me to become who I am or to apply my potential or so on, right? So where's the envisaging going to come here? Can I in turn envisage it, he asks on 119. Center of the paragraph of this, section 4. Can I retain in return this invisible but envisaging face as such, without lowering it to the rank of a constituted and objectivized visible, in respecting its invisibility and saluting its own phenomenality rather. In short, in envisaging it as it envisages me? Is it possible to have a reciprocity of envisaging here, or do we necessarily have to resort to reducing the face of the other to an object, objectifying it? That's the kind of problem that Jean-Paul Sartre famously talks about in his analysis of love in Being and Nothingness. That there's always got to be sort of a kind of a master-slave relationship. The person who's in the dominant position and the person who's in the submissive position. There can never be true reciprocity or equality because of the structure of the gaze. The one is always going to be the one who's looking, and the other is going to be the one who's being looked at. And it may, of course, switch, but it's never going to be true symmetry. But that's not Marian's perspective. So he's not going to follow Sartre, certainly, in this idea. Instead, the way he goes in the final two sections here is to develop this idea of a hermeneutics of the infinite. The solution is to reject the dichotomy between either constituting the other through my intention with a fixed, determinate, finite, limited meaning, or allowing the other to constitute me with a fixed, determinate, finite meaning. Rather, what we need to do is get rid of this idea that the envisaging has to involve a finite, determinate meaning. Instead, what it can involve is a kind of infinite unfolding process of continually assigning different meanings. That's the one of the senses of this word anamorphosis. On the top there, the anamorphosis, which is the idea of the anamorphosis here that he has in mind is those famous pictures of evolution where you have from some higher primate, some ape evolving into Homo sapiens in the stages, right, becoming more and more erect until finally standing upright as Homo sapiens fully. That's an example of kind of anamorphosis, a kind of evolution that leads to a kind of development in the direction of some higher state of perfection, allegedly. But what he's imagining here is a kind of state of progressive adding of meaning that doesn't have a final end, and that also indeed would be subject to revision and so on. That's the way in which faces approach each other, human beings approach each other in this way. And that's the characteristic of the icon, is this sort of endless hermeneutic, the possibility of endlessly assigning new meanings, new interpretations to the other, without ever being able to finally fix the other's meaning, and to just put them in your back pocket and say, oh yeah, I know you're a rascal, or something like that, right? Oh yeah, I know her, she's a saint. You can't ever capture the person in this way, and that's the iconic character. The iconic character of something is this kind of infinite depth that can never be completely captured in any finite set of meanings. So he develops this in some careful detail in the final couple sections here. He introduces the concept of spirit, which I've sort of already tacitly imported in discussing human beings. So the infinity of meanings in the spirit. And it's worth noting that this applies not just to my approach to the other as other, but also really in my approach to myself. Because I'm not ever completely on top of myself either, in a way that I could define myself and my meaning once and for all. Right, so we both have this sort of iconic character. I'm going to skip over a couple points here about truth and lying. On page 121, he provides a useful discussion here in the second paragraph of 121 of the ways in which a face can easily be, when I try to determine its meaning in a fixed way, can easily be reduced to something that's less than a face. So I'm going to read a little bit of this because I think it's very good and useful. 121. So he begins by discussing an objection here to this concept that the way in which we approach a face is through a kind of infinity of ever-developing meanings that never are finally fixed. He says, one could object that the face, most often and to begin with, nevertheless expresses a meaning. For example, that of its passions, which metaphysics wanted to clarify as so many significations of the incarnate spirit, from Descartes to Le Brun. But if I admit that I know and understand the other person in reducing him or her to a state of mind, such that passions reconstitute the other, I only know him or her as a psychological agent of whom I may measure the strengths, the conduct, and the intentions. I then include the other in a social strategy constituting one element among others in such a way that I can contain or make use of him or her. In other words, it's just a reduction of this kind of objectifying consciousness. I view this person as a phenomenon, just like any other phenomenon whose behavior I want to predict. In the way that a biologist is trying to understand the behavior of a living organism, I'm reducing the other to a psychological agent whose motives I want to understand according to some kind of psychological theory so that I can incorporate them into my planning. In this situation, it is no longer a question of a face that envisages me and that confronts me with its call. It is a question of an animated object, which I see as I want and constitute from my point of view. So he considers another example here. When the other person finds himself identified by a professional or social role, technician, notary, doctor, teacher, judge, or so on, no doubt he or she benefits from a definition, and I can assign to the other a meaning. I can even consider that the person's conduct and words express this meaning, but straight away the other disappears as a face. Right? To reduce the other as just, oh yeah, that's my teacher. Right? You see the person in this functional role that could equally well be preserved by someone else who is equally good at performing this function, rather than seeing this person as a face. So, well, it is true, of course, that all the time we assign meanings to spirits or to persons, minds. To do so once and for all in this kind of straitjacketed way that he's describing here, to try to figure the person out, understand their motivations, reduce them into a nutshell, is necessarily to eliminate their character as a face, phenomenally. So there's a cost to preserving the face, though, That is, that we have to give up the idea that we can never really know another person completely. Even, spouses who have lived together for 70 years can't be certain that they really know the person completely, because there's always a kind of open-endedness, even beyond the death of the person. He goes on to discuss, the connection between the work of mourning of a loved one, for example, and continuing to process, as we would tend to say now, the meaning of their life in your own reflections. On page 123, in the center of the paragraph there, he says, "It is once the face of the other person dies that in fact the hermeneutic without end truly commences in it, far from ending. For it is starting from the instance of his or her death that the work of mourning begins, and indissolubly of memory, putting together all the documents and all the memories that remain to us of the other person, discovering in them new ones by association, sifting authenticated facts from false ones, criticizing indirect information, in short, constituting the unconstitutable saturated phenomenon of the other person." He says, really, this process is like what Kant described as the infinite process towards perfection in virtue. You can never really just rest on your laurels and say, okay, I've become a perfect human being. Of course, in our lives, we're very much aware of the fact that we're not perfect. But even if you had a good run, right? Even if you had a good stretch of not really committing any, very grievous sins, you can never really be certain that you are a saint. It's only really something that you could aspire to. And you always have to act as if there's still an infinite life ahead of you to be lived, in which you can continue to develop through this process of anamorphosis, right? Of continually evolving towards a higher and higher state. And parallel to this is our understanding of a spirit or a person that has the character of a face. We can always revise that understanding. We can always add more. It's always possible for us to interpret once again and reinterpret a person. And it's only in faith, he says, it's only through something like the Christian idea of a final judgment where God comes and judges someone once and for all, which is not something we can experience within our phenomenal world. But it's something that we could at least have as an idea to kind of provide us with an idea of where this process might all end, or might all be going, ultimately. Okay, so that basically covers the gist of Marion's view. Of course, we could fill in details, and I hope that you will do that in your comments and ask questions about this and continue the discussion and add some nuances and so on. But that gives us a sense of the parameters, at least, of this chapter between this video and the last one. So this ends this week. So I want to remind everyone that in order to satisfy the substitute attendance requirement, you need to write a substantial comment relative to your level of education in the comment box beneath this video, and also the other two preceding videos from the last 2 days. So you need to have a comment to each one by, let's say, 11:59 p.m. on Friday. Okay, so by Friday, you need to have that done. So I would encourage you that if you haven't, done it yet, to maybe not leave it to the last minute. Give yourself some time to mull this over, to dwell. And I really do strongly also want to encourage people to look at the other students' comments as well, because there's already been some really good ones on the other videos. And I would like to be able to as much as possible, replicate the seminar dynamic of interesting interchanges between participants. So please, I strongly encourage you to read the other comments, maybe to get inspiration for your own, but also to engage with what they're saying, especially if you feel like you have something to add or you disagree, and so on. All right, so we'll see you next week. Stay healthy.